Imagine dying not from disease or old age, but from your own doctors desperately trying to save your life. Picture being tortured for 5 agonizing days by the very people sworn to heal you, drained of your blood, force-fed mercury, having red-hot irons pressed against your skull, and exotic animal parts shoved down your throat. This was the horrific reality for King Charles II of England, who died not from the stroke that initially felled him, but from the barbaric medical treatments that turned his final days into a medieval torture session disguised as healthcare. What happened in Whitehall Palace during those 5 nightmarish days in February 1685 reveals the terrifying ignorance of 17th century medicine and shows how even kings could be killed by the very people trying to save them. Before we dive into the medical nightmare that was 17th century royal healthcare, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because Charles II's death was so brutal that it would be considered torture by today's standards. Charles II had spent the morning of February 2nd, 1685 in his usual manner, indulging in the pleasures that had defined his restoration to the English throne 25 years earlier. At 54 years old, the king maintained the lifestyle of a much younger man, surrounding himself with mistresses, courtiers, and endless entertainment that often lasted well into the early hours of the morning. His court was renowned throughout Europe for its libertine atmosphere, a deliberate rejection of the Puritan austerity that had characterized England during his father's execution and his own exile. The king's daily routine was a carefully orchestrated performance of royal excess. He would rise late, often around noon, having spent the previous evening gambling, drinking, and enjoying the company of his numerous mistresses. Charles maintained at least 14 acknowledged illegitimate children with various women, including the famous actress Nell Gwynn and the aristocratic Barbara Villiers. His queen, Catherine of Braganza, had learned to tolerate these arrangements with the resigned dignity expected of royal wives, though the emotional toll was evident to those close to the court. On this particular February morning, Charles had attended his usual council meetings, but courtiers noticed he seemed unusually tired and occasionally stumbled over his words. The king, however, dismissed any concerns and proceeded with his planned activities. He had dinner with his brother James, Duke of York, and several courtiers, consuming his typical heavy meal of rich meats, wine, and elaborate desserts that characterized royal dining in the Restoration period. Charles's reputation as the merry monarch had been carefully cultivated to contrast with the grim years of Cromwell's Commonwealth. He encouraged theater, music, and scientific advancement, while maintaining a court atmosphere that celebrated pleasure and intellectual curiosity. The Royal Society, founded during his reign, reflected his genuine interest in natural philosophy and scientific discovery, though his personal life remained focused on more immediate gratifications. The king's health had been generally robust throughout his life, though court physicians had occasionally expressed concern about his lifestyle. Charles rarely exercised beyond walking his beloved spaniels through the palace gardens, and his diet consisted almost entirely of rich, heavy foods, accompanied by substantial quantities of wine and ale. He had suffered occasional minor illnesses, but had always recovered quickly, leading him to believe he was essentially indestructible. As evening approached on February 2nd, Charles retired to his private chambers in Whitehall Palace, planning to spend the night with one of his current favorites. The rooms were luxuriously appointed with tapestries, fine furniture, and the various scientific instruments that reflected his intellectual interests. His personal servants prepared his bedchamber according to the elaborate protocols that governed every aspect of royal life, from the thread count of his sheets to the specific temperature of his washing water. Charles fell asleep that night, believing he was in perfect health, surrounded by the trappings of absolute power and unlimited pleasure. He had no way of knowing that within hours, his world would collapse into a medical nightmare that would transform him from an omnipotent monarch into a helpless victim of 17th century medical ignorance. The man who had restored joy and celebration to England was about to experience a death so agonizing that it would horrify even his enemies. Charles II awakened on the morning of February 6, 1680, feeling unusually unwell, but determined to maintain his normal routine. He had experienced what he described as a restless night and complained of a slight headache. But these symptoms seemed minor enough that he proceeded with his planned activities. The king's personal servants helped him dress in his usual elaborate court attire, and he made his way to his private closet to perform his morning ablutions. It was in this private chamber, while his valet was shaving him, that Charles suddenly stiffened and let out a terrible cry. Witnesses later described how the king's face contorted in agony, his eyes rolled back, and his entire body began convulsing violently. The razor fell from the startled valet's hand as Charles collapsed to the floor, his limbs jerking uncontrollably and foam streaming from his mouth. The sound of his fall and the servants' screams brought courtiers running from every direction. The Duke of York, Charles's brother and heir, was among the first to reach the scene. He found the king lying on the floor of his closet, his face gray, and his breathing labored and irregular. Charles was conscious, but clearly in severe distress, trying to speak, but only managing incoherent mumbles. His left side appeared to be partially paralyzed, and he seemed unable to control the movements of his limbs. Word spread through Whitehall Palace with terrifying speed. Courtiers, servants, and government officials gathered in the corridors outside the king's chambers, their faces reflecting the panic that gripped everyone who understood the political implications of Charles's condition. The king had no legitimate heir, and his brother James was a Catholic whose succession would likely plunge England into religious and political chaos. Dr. Edmund King, the royal physician, arrived within minutes of being summoned. His examination revealed the classic symptoms of what modern medicine would recognize as a massive stroke: partial paralysis, difficulty speaking, irregular pulse, and obvious cognitive impairment. However, 17th century medical knowledge had no understanding of cardiovascular disease or brain function, leaving Dr. King to interpret these symptoms through the lens of medieval medical theory. According to the medical beliefs of the time, Charles's condition was caused by an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Dr. King concluded that the king was suffering from an excess of blood that was creating pressure in his brain and corrupting his other vital fluids. The prescribed treatment would be aggressive bloodletting to reduce this supposed excess, combined with purging to eliminate the corrupted humors through evacuation. As more physicians arrived at the palace, they confirmed Dr. King's diagnosis and agreed on the treatment protocol. What followed would be 5 days of medical torture that would ultimately kill the king they were trying to save. Charles, still partially conscious and aware of his surroundings, would be subjected to increasingly desperate and brutal treatments as his doctors became more convinced that they needed to take extreme measures to save their patient. The transformation from healthy monarch to dying victim had taken less than an hour, but the agony that would define Charles II's final days was just beginning. The king who had survived civil war, exile, and political upheaval was about to be destroyed by the very people who loved him most. Within hours of Charles II's collapse, His bedchamber had been transformed into a medieval torture chamber, disguised as a medical facility. Dr. Edmund King, joined by a team of the most distinguished physicians in England, began implementing the aggressive treatment protocol they believed would save their king's life. What they actually initiated was a systematic destruction of Charles's already weakened body through procedures that would be considered barbaric torture by any modern standard. The bloodletting began immediately and continued relentlessly throughout Charles's ordeal. The doctors opened veins in his arms and allowed his blood to flow into large bowls, believing they were reducing the dangerous pressure in his brain. When arm veins proved insufficient, they moved to his neck, then his temples, draining pint after pint of blood from a man whose cardiovascular system was already compromised. Modern estimates suggest that Charles lost nearly half his total blood volume during these 5 days, leaving him severely anemic and weakening his body's ability to recover from the original stroke. Purging became the second pillar of Charles's treatment, implemented through increasingly violent methods. The physicians administered powerful laxatives and emetics designed to evacuate his bowels and stomach, believing they were expelling corrupted humors. When oral medications proved insufficient, they resorted to massive enemas, forcing gallons of liquid into Charles's rectum to promote evacuation. The king, already weakened by blood loss, was subjected to hours of uncontrollable diarrhea and vomiting that left him dehydrated and exhausted. The treatments became progressively more desperate and bizarre as Charles's condition failed to improve. Red-hot irons were applied to his shaved skull in a process called cauterizing, intended to burn away the corrupted humors that were supposedly affecting his brain. The smell of burning flesh filled the royal chambers as the king's scalp was systematically burned, leaving him with permanent scars and excruciating pain that added to his existing agony. Mercury, considered a miraculous cure-all in 17th century medicine, was administered in massive doses both orally and rectally. This toxic metal, now known to cause severe neurological damage and organ failure, was forced into Charles's body in quantities that would have been lethal even for a healthy person. The mercury poisoning added tremors, confusion, and additional neurological symptoms to his existing stroke-related disabilities. Perhaps most grotesquely, the physicians began administering what they called exotic remedies, substances derived from animals and plants that were believed to possess magical healing properties. Charles was force-fed powdered rhinoceros horn, dissolved pearls, crushed emeralds, and the gallbladders of various animals. These substances, apart from being medically useless, often caused additional digestive distress and toxicity. The king's family members were forced to watch helplessly as their beloved monarch was systematically tortured by the very people they had summoned to save him. Queen Catherine sat by his bedside, holding his hand, while trying not to show her horror at the treatments being inflicted on her husband. The Duke of York paced the chambers, torn between his desire to stop the torture and his fear that dismissing the doctors might be seen as condemning his brother to death. Charles himself, during his moments of lucidity, seemed to understand that the treatments were causing him additional suffering, but he lacked the strength to resist or the authority to countermand his physician's orders. The king, who had once commanded absolute power, was now completely helpless, subject to medical procedures that were slowly killing him. By February 10th, Charles II's 5th day of medical torture, even his physicians were beginning to recognize that their treatments were not producing the miraculous recovery they had promised. The king's condition had deteriorated dramatically under their care. He was barely conscious, severely dehydrated from constant purging, weakened by massive blood loss, and suffering from mercury poisoning on top of his original stroke. Yet rather than questioning their methods, the doctors concluded they needed to implement even more extreme measures to save their patient. The final day of Charles's life saw the most desperate and brutal treatments yet attempted. Additional cauterizations were applied to his skull, creating new burns on top of the existing wounds. More blood was drained from his already depleted veins, and exotic substances were forced down his throat in increasingly large quantities. The physicians even attempted a primitive form of brain surgery, boring small holes in his skull in the belief that this would release the evil humors that were corrupting his mind. Charles drifted in and out of consciousness throughout this final day, his moments of awareness filled with unbearable pain from the cumulative effects of 5 days of medical assault. When he could speak, witnesses reported that he apologized repeatedly to his family and servants for the trouble his illness was causing, displaying the same grace and consideration that had characterized his reign even while enduring unimaginable suffering. The Queen never left his bedside during these final hours, holding his hand and whispering prayers while tears streamed down her face. She had watched her husband transformed from a vital, charismatic king into a broken shell of a man, destroyed not by disease, but by the misguided efforts of those trying to heal him. The Duke of York stood nearby, preparing himself for the crown that would soon be his, while mourning the brother he was about to lose. As evening approached on February 10th, Charles's breathing became increasingly labored and irregular. The physicians finally acknowledged that their patient was dying, though they continued to attribute his condition to the original illness rather than recognizing their role in his demise. Charles's last coherent words were reportedly an apology to those around him and a request for forgiveness for his many sins. King Charles II died just before midnight on February 10, 1685, after 5 days of medical torture that had transformed a survivable stroke into a death sentence. Modern medical analysis suggests that Charles could likely have recovered from his original stroke with proper rest and supportive care. Instead, he was killed by bloodletting that caused severe anemia, mercury poisoning that destroyed his remaining neurological function, and dehydration from constant purging that stressed his already compromised cardiovascular system. The irony of Charles's death was not lost on those who understood the medical realities. The merry monarch, who had survived civil war, execution of his father, years of exile, and numerous political crises, was ultimately destroyed by the very people who loved him most and were trying desperately to save his life. His death marked not only the end of an era in English history, but also a tragic demonstration of how medical ignorance, no matter how well-intentioned, could transform healing into torture and turn doctors into inadvertent executioners. The next time you complain about modern healthcare, remember King Charles II, a man who was literally tortured to death by doctors trying to save him. His agonizing final days remind us how far medical science has advanced and how deadly good intentions can be when combined with ignorance. If this shocking story of medical horror disguised as royal treatment amazed you, smash that like button. Subscribe for more untold tales from history's darkest medical practices, and hit that notification bell, because the most important lessons often come from understanding how terrifyingly wrong even the most educated people can be. What other historical medical practices do you think would horrify us today? Share your thoughts in the comments below.